Welcome back, everybody. It's another episode of Everything is a Spring. Derek, how are you, buddy?
I'm doing good, Jim. Excited to be back. A little hiatus, but we're back in the saddle.
We're back in it, boys. Yeah, so I don't know if you guys have been following. Well, the news cycle has been very full of many things lately, but the thing that started it all, the thing that started the entire podcast has returned, Derek.
What's that?
That would be the Titan Submersible. So I don't know if you remember this at this point, but the inciting incident for us starting this podcast was that the Titan Submersible imploded, and we were talking about it at the Vortex in Atlanta, and we were chatting about it, and we were like, we should do a podcast, and here we are. You know,
it comes full circle. Episode 20.
It does.
Yeah, I forgot that's what we were talking about because that's what like drove the engineering. That's crazy that you remember that. That was at least 18 months ago.
Yeah, that was quite a while ago. I'm a huge nerd, right? So like listening and watching some of these documents and these testimonials or testimony come out of the United States Coast Guard hearing has been really, really exciting for me. And it's really kind of been interesting to kind of see what I thought was happening and see what was wrong and see what was right. I think it's still important that we treat this with the respect it deserves because again, people did lose their lives in this accident. But at the same time, it's Derek, it's so much worse. It's
See, that's
so
exciting because like I haven't thought about the Titan Submersible in a long time apparently, and I haven't been following it. I've been making the mistake of following U.S. politics as we get towards November here. So this is really exciting.
It's very interesting, and so I guess let's just get into it. So the United States Coast Guard was they are the people who were responsible to responding to the distress call that the Polar Prince, which was the vessel that was hosting the Titan Submersible, called out. And they were in charge of directing search and rescue operations.
Well, let's back up a little bit. In the event that none of our listeners know what we're talking about, what is the Titan Submersible?
This is a fair point. The Titan Submersible was an experimental submersible really designed by OceanGate and Stockton Rush to carry passengers, paying passengers, to the Titanic wreck site as a tourist experience / adventure tourism type deal.
So it didn't have any like research. It wasn't a research submersible. It was just for like profit.
No, not a research vessel as far as I'm aware. Specifically, the mandate of OceanGate was to make the ocean floor accessible to tourism. And of course, the Titanic is kind of the site you want to go see. I really actually see a lot of connections and like a lot of equivalency to like Mount Everest.
Oh yeah.
Right. Like this
is like people going up there and just dying unprepared for this. I guess, is it the adventure that gets folks that want to do that, or
I think so.
Is it the challenge?
I think they're a little bit different. So I think with specifically with Everest, I think it is like this idea of like conquering the tallest peak on Earth, right? I do think there is, like to a certain extent of like adrenaline thrill seeking type thing. But I think with Everest, it's just such a long process that it really is like, this very monumental, like I climbed and I've beaten the earth basically, right? Like I've been to the tallest point on the planet. So I can conquer anything. I think it's
a power thing.
I think it's a power thing. At least that's what it would be for me if I went.
So the Mount Everest thing hurts for me because like as a wannabe conservationalist, if you look at like Mount Everest in its early days when it was folks just with that thrill seeking adventure, wanting to be the first, etc. Then you get this next generation of folks, right? They're using the native population for all intents and purposes, not in the best ways. And at this point, if you look at a stock image or a satellite image of Mount Everest, it is covered in litter. It has been destroyed. Like this most beautiful point so far out of reach of man. We really commercialized it in a way. Yeah. And it's really sad. It doesn't have the same story as like the first few folks who were trying to conquer the mountain or the folks that were just like on a spiritual journey and this is their way of, doing that. It's really a sad story in the end of the day, but
I think like there are some cleanup efforts about Everest that are happening now. That's actually something I also went down a rabbit hole recently about, ironically, but there are cleanup efforts by the Nepalese government, that are happening, including removing some of the bodies from the mountain. But it's a huge undertaking. I mean, it is a serious undertaking. And you're right. There has been a lot of trash and a lot of, not great conservation going on the mountain. But, that's aside from the point. But to get back to it, I do think like there are a lot of parallels between kind of the adventure tourism of, for example, climbing Mount Everest, but it could also be, like traveling through, the jungle or whatever, and going to the Titanic wreck site or anywhere deep sea, right? The difference, though, I think, is that, for example, if you're climbing Mount Everest, a huge factor in your success, survival, and safety is going to be like you. Like
training. Yeah.
Are you trained properly? Are you lucky to a certain extent? And, have you done everything correctly? The big difference I see with the Titan submersible, or any submersible really, that you're using for this adventure tourism, is that the passengers have no real impact on their journey, right? They're really just
I see what you mean. Yeah, you have to put a lot of faith. It's like getting on a modern airliner.
Yeah.
You're trusting that Boeing did their job. You're trusting that American Airlines did their job. You're just along for the ride for all intents and purposes.
Yeah. And
you can train all you want. It doesn't matter.
And unless you're the pilot, you're really not doing anything. You're just hanging out,
Gosh. Oh, so I see where you're going with it. It's like the adventure tourism is really just a ticket in this situation. It's not like you're dependent on your own survival, which I think puts more of the blame on the folks that, designed the thing and failed to maintenance, I'm going to assume.
Right.
I'm really excited to hear what you found.
So, yeah. So I do think, so the Titan submersible, to wrap it up, is kind of this adventure tourism thing that Stockton Rush dreamed up. And the Titan submersible is actually not the first sub that OceanGate built. I believe it's actually the third. So there was this one sub called the Cyclops, which was the same idea, the same concept, but for a much lower depth. So it didn't go nearly as deep, and they didn't have obviously nearly as many issues with it because, much less pressure on the vessel. But it was
much danger,
much less pressure, but it was kind of the proof of concept, right? So you had, basically like shallow water dives to go see coral reefs and go see sharks and stuff like this. And really, it proved out the business model of like take passengers down to see cool stuff in the ocean. So following the success of the Cyclops, OceanGate started developing the Titan. And the Titan was always intended to be a deep sea, manned, crewed submersible. And one of the things that they did that was very controversial was they decided to make the hull of the Titan submersible out of carbon fiber. Derek, do you know what carbon fiber is?
Yeah, it's like carbon microfilaments. It looks like wire, and they weave it into this like mesh with epoxy. And on paper, really strong. It's super light compared to like steel or titanium. You see it a lot in like, for example, they use it in SpaceX. The fins on the Falcon 9 were titanium. I think they have some carbon fiber parts they're looking at now just for like weight distribution. But I think the problem, as I'm starting to recognize, is that when you have carbon fiber, you have a fiber. It's not like a homogeneous structure.
That's right. So carbon fiber is obviously made of filaments. And they are bound together using an epoxy matrix. That's the most common kind. When we're referring to carbon fiber as a building material, we're really talking about a composite. We're talking about carbon fiber composite, usually using epoxy as the binding medium. And
what do they do? Just like shape it into like whatever shape they want and then epoxy over it?
Depends. But basically for this type of construction, what you do is you will pre-impregnate the fiberglass. Basically, you're going to make tape rolls of carbon fiber. And then as you're laying it up, you're squeezing epoxy onto it and into it. And then as you roll it up, that epoxy is then going to be binding to the previous layers that also have epoxy pre-impregnated onto them. There are actually a lot of different ways to do carbon fiber, but we won't get into all of those today. But the Titan submersibles were made with with pre-preg windings, called pre-preg because it's pre-impregnated with epoxy.
Epoxy. Okay.
And then it's ultimately cured in an autoclave, so it's under pressure and heat to help with the curing process to make sure everything fully cures in a timely manner. And the pressure
sounds great for a no pressure environment.
Yeah. So carbon fiber is actually super strong, as you said, especially in tension, because all the fibers, right, are going to be loaded under tension. But if in compression, carbon fiber is not as good. And the reason for that is because if you try to push a string, it just kind of noodles up.
Yeah.
And so most of your strength in a compressive loading mechanism is really coming from the epoxy bond and not as much from the carbon fiber itself.
So you mean to tell me they made a submarine out of glue for all intents and purposes?
I mean, kind of. So the carbon fiber does still contribute a significant amount of strength, but not nearly as much as in tension. But that being said, I don't think the carbon fiber is ultimately what broke first.
Oh.
I do think the carbon fiber still led to the failure, but I don't think the carbon fiber was the primary cause, but we'll get into that later. But lots of people basically were saying during the development and building of the Titan submersible that the carbon fiber was a really bad idea. And I still agree with that, but for different reasons that we'll get into later. So, that was very controversial, but the Titan submersible ultimately was constructed out of carbon fiber hull with titanium end caps on the ends of the carbon fiber and then titanium hemispheres bolted to those end caps to create the pressure vessel.
I have a dumb question.
What you got?
Why carbon fiber if you're already using titanium? Isn't titanium like proven?
Yes. So most submersibles, especially the deep sea submersibles, use a titanium or steel pressure vessel completely constructed of titanium and steel. And the reason for that fundamentally is that titanium and steel are both metals, and that means that we can test those metals for homogeny and also for flaws very reliably because we understand those materials very, very well. They're very mature materials in terms of like engineering. They're mature and we understand them. And
we have a lot of research.
Yes. And you can non-destructively test them for flaws. So for example, if you have a weld line, you can use an ultrasonic implement to basically quote unquote look into the material to see if there are any cracks.
It's like the same way you use like an ultrasound to see a baby or like a CAT scan. You're just looking through the material with radiation and you can see if it's not a lattice structure anymore.
Yeah, pretty much. So not so much like you can't see like the molecular structure, but you can see flaws in the material, right? Like you can see cracks. And that's actually super beneficial, not only in the original manufacturing, but also for like maintenance and like periodic checking of the hull to make sure that it's still intact over a series of dives, right? So you can actually basically take an ultrasonic reader basically and inspect the hull periodically, which is extremely important. As we've talked about previously, cyclic fatigue and loading is one of the primary causes, and also I believe the cause ultimately of the Titan submersible failure.
We talked about the fundamentals of that, like in the first few episodes, we were talking about like pressure vessels and weird fluids.
Yes.
Like back in the day, they had an excuse because that technology just didn't exist. You had to just inspect it with your eyes or like have someone crawl into the tank to see it with their eyes. But now, you can x-ray it or like use an ultrasound. Yeah. Well, so how did this happen?
So to follow up on why we're using carbon fiber, why the Titan submersible uses carbon fiber obviously is a lot lighter than titanium or steel. And basically what that gets you is you have a higher buoyancy to weight ratio. And if you have a higher buoyancy to weight ratio, that means you can take more passengers. And
more floaty.
More floaty, more people in the sub. More people in
More
the
money.
sub, more money. And again,
Cash.
never forget that OceanGate fundamentally was a for-profit company.
Do you know how much did a ticket for this death trap cost?
I think it was like it was $250,000, I believe.
$250,000?
$250,000 to go see the Titanic.
So you take 10 people down, you're rich. Just like one successful trip is enough.
I mean, potentially. I mean, there's obviously a lot of expense with creating the sub and getting it out there. And I mean, there's a lot of expense. But yeah, I mean, like tickets are pretty expensive.
I can't afford that.
Yeah, me neither. But yeah, so you basically have like a maximum of 4 passengers because you have to have a pilot. So you're going to have,
Oh, gotcha.
you know, but still $1 million a dive, basically.
Shoot.
Obviously there's going to be a lot of expense, but you know, $1 million a dive. Well, it's pretty good, you know.
It is an exciting prospect on paper. Like I could see if I did have the money, like that would be a cool,
Oh, it'd be awesome.
unique trip. Like
Yeah.
it's the closest you can get to like going to space. Well, I guess nowadays you actually can go to space if you have enough money. But
Yeah.
before, you know.
Yeah, no, I think it's super cool. I mean, in concept, I think it's awesome. I think the execution is really tragic.
Oh, it was an execution, that's for sure.
Yeah. So
Sorry, this is a comedy podcast. I'm not. I it is what it is.
that's fine. But anyways, so that's why they decided to use carbon fiber. And the main concerns from the industry were basically that carbon fiber is, not really great in compression, not as strong as it is in tension, at least. And then additionally, it's very difficult to periodically inspect carbon fiber. And the reason for that is because the carbon fiber, by merit of it being a non-homogeneous material, is going to be really hard to look at non-destructively. Basically because, for example, if you put the ultrasound onto it, all you're going to see is all these crisscrossing fibers, right? And And so cracks can hide in there and you're just not going to be able to see them physically.
So wait, when you said earlier the industry warned them about this, you mean like the submarine industry?
Yeah. So there's actually like a lot of people, not a lot of people. There is a community. there's a community of deep submersibles, right? So like James Cameron famously is one. He's went down to the Marianas Trench and the Titanic multiple times. There's actually a lot of these deep sea, like there's deep sea like ROVs and stuff like this.
The Navy.
Yeah. There's a fair amount of people, probably several hundred people who are kind of in this space that are quote unquote subject matter experts, who have been, brought onto the news channels and to the Coast Guard hearings and all these things to talk
about James Cameron, the director?
Yeah. He's been to the Titanic like a lot of times. And he's been gone down to the Marianas Trench. He's
I
actually
didn't realize he was a sub guy. That's cool.
Deep sea submersible enthusiast by all accounts. So lots of people basically were telling Stockton Rush, hey, this carbon fiber thing is not a good idea.
We have a warning.
So there's some warnings out there. But on the flip side, in defense of Stockton Rush, the United States Navy actually created a carbon fiber deep sea submersible that has actually gone to deeper depths than the Titanic. So
Is it a drone?
It is.
Okay, then. It's the Navy.
Yes, it is. It is a ROV, so a remote operated vehicle. But it was kind of the proof of concept. And I believe that it does use, titanium end bells like the Titan. And I'll shoot you a picture of it. It's called the AUSS. But yeah, Stockton Rush, I mean, like that was his thing, right? It was like, yeah, he's the deep sea, open up the deep sea to the world guy. That was like his passion of his life, right?
It's a good idea on paper.
Oh, dude, again, I'm here for it on paper. And I think if you execute it correctly, and there are people who are executing, very successful, submersible tourism, right? They're one of the guys in the United States Coast Guard hearing, I believe his name is, Carl Stanley. So Carl Stanley was a friend of Stockton Rush, before the whole, I don't think they're friends now, even posthumously. He seemed very upset, with Stockton Rush at the hearing. But Carl Stanley was actually one of the crew who did the test dive for the Titan V1. And there actually were 2 Titan submersibles. So this is not particular. Did you know that there were 2 Titan submersibles?
No, I didn't even know they had another sub. I thought this was the proof of concept. You're telling me they had 3. So they had the first one, Titan 1, then this is Titan 2 we're talking about.
Yeah. So Titan 1 was the first Titan sub, and it was actually, hold on, I have Titan Hull V1 was manufactured in 2017. And it's the same idea. It's a carbon fiber epoxy composite hull. And then with the end bells and everything. And I'll send you a picture of it. It looks a little bit more DIY than V2. If that is, like the motors are exposed and, there's stuff everywhere. But by and large, it's the same thing.
It looks really similar.
Yes. So very, very similar. Honestly, the only difference that I can really tell is that the V2 had more shrouding around the motors and thrusters and on the top to kind of keep all the cords and stuff from getting potentially tangled and things.
Oh, I see. It's cool to see this view because I didn't have any context on how this thing moves.
Yeah, so it does have ballast, but it also has these thrusters that allow it to move. And then it also has weights that it can drop to ascend. So there's actually give credit where credit is due. They had a fair amount of thought put into some of it.
I gotta admit, it does look cool.
It looks super cool.
It looks cool. It doesn't look like any other submarine. Like if you look at the Navy sub that you showed earlier.
Yeah. Yeah, and
USS.
And the big viewport in the front. I mean, there's certainly there's some cool stuff about it. But anyway, back to the Titan 1. So the Titan 1 was again manufactured 2017. It's got these titanium rings that are bonded to each end, and it's capped by these titanium domes, basically identical in exterior looking to the Titan 2. But they discovered cracks in the composite hull during a pre-dive inspection in 2019, and they removed it from service.
Okay. That sounds like the right call.
Yes. Here is some pictures. Basically what they ended up doing, and then they took the sub apart and cut it up and did some analysis on it, which is good. That's what we want to see. So they actually did and found some they took a cross section basically of the Titan and then looked at it, and they found cracking and delamination in the hull of Titan V1.
Oh, I appreciate the scale at the bottom, so I know what I'm looking at. This is you can see that with your eyes.
Yeah, so these are from the NTSB analysis.
Of the first Titan. Wait, so these guys already got a record with the NTSB?
Well, it might actually be supplied by the current investigation, but it was done at the time. It probably was done by OceanGate at the time, but I'm not sure about that.
Was this a National Travel Safety Board? Transport Safety Board?
National Transport Safety Board.
They're the guys that they every time a plane crashes or a train derails, they're involved.
Yes, they do lots of analyses. The Titan falls under their purview, very perfectly.
They're pretty popular too. Even foreign nations that deal with crashes, they call the American NTSB. Because,
that's right.
They got experience.
So one of the causes of these delaminations, there were several, one of which was it was struck by lightning.
And hell no, delamination is just layers peeling apart?
That's correct.
Okay.
That's correct. And one of the things they found was basically that they one of the problems that they found was that there were wrinkles in the hull, and that was contributing. As you laminate it up, these wrinkles just develop as part of the process because it's a circular procedure and just what it is.
It happens, yeah.
It happens. And that is one of the contributing factors that causes some of the delaminating issues. So
you're saying that's a part of the manufacturing process. That's not even multiple dives that causes that.
Basically, the dives ultimately are what causes it. Because those wrinkles are there, it creates a stress riser that the crack can propagate from. Does that make sense? Right. So
on paper, the beginning of the crack's there once they build it. They just don't know it.
Not exactly. So basically, if you're looking at, because it's a circle, right? The stress is supposed to run all the way around the circle. But because the stress is going to be following the layer lines of the epoxy, or the composite rather, the wrinkle is going to create this little bend. So that stress, rather than having a smooth, path to follow, it has this kink in it. And that kink is going to create basically what's called like a stress riser. And so that stress riser basically creates a point where, compared to the surrounding material, that particular part of the material is under more loading than the rest of it. And so that is where cracks might start, basically. Does that make sense?
Oh, yeah, that makes sense. And the picture you just sent me, those circles like in Sharpie, that's actually the stress riser?
So if you look at it, that picture, there's basically, so there's like a little circle at the top of it. That's a wrinkle. So that wrinkle,
wow.
And there's a couple
bends
more.
a lot.
Yeah, it does. And I'll shoot you some more of other wrinkles. So what they end up doing, to combat that, right? So they end up
big old hammer, just smack it.
just smack it back in. So the picture that I actually sent you, they ended up, after they retire the V1 hull, they make they make two subscale, I think it's like 1/3 scale, I believe, is what they do. 1/3 scale hull sections to test, which is good. This is where they discover that the wrinkles are a big problem, because they end up having these mid-thickness delaminations that are happening at the wrinkle sites, and these hull subscale sections are imploding below the equivalent pressure of 2,800 meters, which obviously is not deep enough to go to the Titanic, which is where they want to go.
Right.
So they're like, okay, well, we got to come up with something, and these wrinkles are what causing the problem. So what do you do? How can you, Derek, what do you think you would do if you had to like get these wrinkles out of this carbon fiber hull? How would you do it?
I don't even know how to start with that. It's such a complex material. I'm guessing big hammer's not the answer. Do you it's not something you can patch over. What do you do?
So what they decided to do is basically, because what they notice is that the wrinkle starts small and then it gets bigger as you go out, because it compounds on itself, basically. So what they decided to do is, rather than lay up one single massive, because the hull is like 5 inches thick. So rather than laying up one single 5-inch thick composite hull, what they decided to do is like, okay, well, let's make it 1 inch at a time, cure the first layer, grind it smooth, and then lay up another inch on top of that, and then grind it smooth, and then build a hull out, right?
Is that a good idea?
Well, it sounds good on paper. And I think there is potentially some promise there. But fundamentally, from what I've been able to find and what the United States Coast Guard documents show, is that they ultimately did not make any scale models of this. It's what's called a co-bonded or multi-core process. So they did not do any scale models of this multi-core, co-bonded construction. Which to me is like a red flag. Like, I would really like to see some scale testing like they did with the previous one to see if they find any problems. And I think that ultimately there are problems with it, and we'll get into that. So that's, so basically they're building up these layers, right? And you can see though, you still actually end up having wrinkles form, but they're not as big. So you can still see that there's actually a fair amount of wrinkling in the hull. So ultimately, what's confusing to me is that they ended up not really fixing the problem. And
if anything, you made it more complex.
They did. And that complexity had a price. And ultimately, what ends up happening, we won't get into it yet because we're not there. And so you can see that there's this lifting in the layer lines, and then they just grind it. They sand it flat. And then they epoxy the next layer on top of it.
Oh, they're doing,
Yeah.
I thought when you were saying they ground it flat, I thought they were doing like the outer layer. They're doing that on every layer. So
They're
now you
doing
have
that,
like
yeah.
waves. Oh, you're adding more bulges.
Yeah,
You're
well-
going to press up into the next layer.
So that's why they grind it down, right? So they grind it down so that it doesn't press up into the next layer, so that the next layer can go on smooth. But ultimately, like, if you look at it, it looks to me like those are still compounding on each other. And there's actually some data, to support that, right? So they actually ended up doing a count on that hull section that they took on these. Basically, those hull sections were the end cuts. Basically, they wound the hull and they made it a little bit extra length so they could cut off the ends where there might be any defects. Those obviously never went to the Titanic, so they're in pristine condition. from, manufacture. So we were able to examine them, which was really cool to be able to look and see. So you can actually see they're counting these wrinkles, and there's still a lot of wrinkles by the time you get to the outside in the fourth layer. And then the fifth layer, they didn't grind it smooth because there was no point to doing it because they weren't laying out another one. But the problem that you end up with, though, is that you end up with all these. First of all, there's potential for, obviously there's potential for issues in the fiber or the carbon fiber itself, right? There could be bubbles in the glue or whatever, and that can cause problems. But additionally, when you're doing this co-bonded, multi-core build, you now also have an intermediate layer of epoxy bonding these two composites together, these two composite surfaces together. And what they found is there's actually quite a lot of void in that epoxy layer. But basically in the glue line, you have all these voids. And this is not from the ruptured section of the hull. This is from, again, those end trimmings that are quote unquote pristine, that were trimmed off of the hull before it ever got assembled into the final form, right? So this is very concerning for a lot of reasons. Voids in your adhesive means that you're not going to have the strength that you think you're going to have.
Right.
And also those voids, because they are weak points, also can create stress risers, right? So these are points from which delaminations can spread.
Yeah, and it's just space. Like you're talking about a pressure vessel that's going deep sea. If the whole thing's supposed to compress in on itself and you're compressing it unevenly because there's a glue layer missing for all intents and purposes. I know this is like borderline microscopic, but that's a lot of void. If I'm looking at the dark, the greens, the glue, and then there's a lot of like black specks where it's just, it looks like a first grader like glued it on there, but they didn't take their time.
Yeah. Yeah. So basically like there's these, very dark gray layers, and then the glue is this kind of greenish color. And yeah, I mean, there's just empty spots in it. Ultimately, what you end up having is when the Titan submersible failed, you had these massive delaminations form. And it primarily, those delaminations formed along the glue lines. Once they finally go down there, because you have all these voids in the epoxy, what you end up finding is that the hull delaminates primarily into three main sections. There's a very large chunk of the hull that's sort of intact-ish. And it's predominantly composed of layer 1, layers 2 and 3, and then layers 4 and 5. So when the carbon fiber was ripped apart by the pressure of the ocean, ultimately it failed along the glue lines. That's not really what you want to see. Generally, when you see composite failure, you want to see the failure happening across the different layers as opposed to all through one layer. That would indicate a failure of the adhesive.
I'm going to assume you don't want to see a composite failure at all.
Well, that's true. That's true. But like if a composite, because you should be testing these things, right?
These are something you find in your scale models.
This is something that, and again, like I've not been able to find any evidence that OceanGate produced scale models of a multi-core co-bonded hull that the V2 was ultimately made from, which to me, again, is a red flag, one of many red flags.
I mean, the damn ship seems like a red flag.
Yeah. So that's the carbon fiber hull. Now what I want to talk about is the titanium end bells and end rings. So this is a picture of the titanium end ring right here. And you can see that it's basically, there's this like C channel that bonds to the epoxy, bonds to the carbon fiber hull through an epoxy joint. And that can be seen in the lower part of this image right there. And the basic structure of it, if you go into a cross-sectional view, is right here. You can see this is a stress analysis of that titanium bell and ring system. And so there's basically the interface between the carbon fiber and the hull is basically like if you take your hand and make a big C and then put your fist into it, Your fist is the carbon fiber, and the C shape is the titanium. And so that is your interface. Now, if you look at the stress analysis of the titanium end bell, it's very clear that the titanium is more than strong enough to sustain the kind of loading that we are seeing at these depths and these pressures. So that's cool. And
titanium's not the problem here.
The titanium's not the problem here. My opinion is ultimately that the glue joint is what failed. But let's finish talking about the Titan sub before we get into that too much. One of the other big things about the Titan sub that kind of drew a lot of controversy and also drew like some additional criticism, I suppose, is really the window.
Oh, the actual like viewing thing at the front?
Yes, the acrylic window at the front. Yeah, so here's a view of what the standard viewing window would be, and it's a spherical window, right? So you end up having these sections because of the purely circular nature of it. It's extremely strong, right? So it's a spherical window, and what that creates is very easy paths for the stress to go and be transferred into the window's seat, which of course is made out of that titanium and is very, very strong. The problem with that spherical design is that you can't really see out of it very well because the spherical nature of it distorts the view. So what they wanted to do is they wanted to use a flat back. And so you're actually adding material to the design, but kind of unintuitively, you actually end up making the design weaker that way.
And so the window's not one pane, it's like two panes put together?
No, it is one pane. It is one pane. But you're just adding a hemispherical section. I believe it's made out of cast acrylic. Acrylic is actually a really good use case here because it's softer than the titanium, and so it will push in and conform to that surface and create a really, really good seal. So this actually, acrylic windows is actually a really good thing to use. This is the correct thing to use. However, once you look at the stress and the strain, what you end up seeing is that the addition of that extra material creates a stress riser, because now you basically have, and you can see that stress. This is actually really interesting.
Help me as a biologist. What am I looking at here?
This is basically a map of where the material is under load. This is looking at deformation of the material. So the red is lots of deformation. The green is not much deformation at all. And the blue is basically no deformation. And what you end up seeing is that there's this little red flare at the corner of the inside of the window that kind of shoots off into the left, like up into the left in kind of a circular arc. And so ultimately what happens is and you can see it again here. So then what you're doing, what you can see here is that this little red plume at that corner is basically, it's a warning basically like, hey, we might start to see cyclical loading failure here. There might be some creeping failure effects. Basically, as you stress and de-stress this piece of acrylic, that is a stress riser. And so ultimately what happens is the company that made this window for them did not certify it to the Titanic depths because they did not have confidence that it was going to perform over time. Stockton Rush knew this. There's some emails back and forth.
What?
Oh, yeah. Oh, the window is like a big point of concern.
And the folks that manufactured it told them they didn't do nothing?
They did it anyway. Because fundamentally, originally, they were intending to use this spherical design that you see up here. And this would have been certified to that depth. But because they wanted that optical clarity, obviously it's a passenger vehicle, right? Like the whole point is that the tourists can actually see the Titanic with their own eyes, right? That's the whole draw. You can't use cameras, like you have to use it. So they end up going with this design, and there's some discussion. Let me see if I can find the email, because the emails are part of this chain.
Oh, that's damning.
Yeah. So there is some interest, right? So like the company that made the window has basically done like this engineering analysis pro bono, because if it works, there's like a lot of really good application in other submersibles, right? So as we discussed, there is strong interest among other MUV manufacturers of the same type of geometry. The optical benefits are a strong motivating factor for all involved. Basically, they end up saying that they should be doing more research on this. Ultimately, they don't. The acrylic window is another point of concern because it was never certified for the depths they were going to. But ultimately, I don't think the acrylic window is what failed either. I think if you had seen the Titan submersible do many, many, many more dives, perhaps you would have seen the acrylic begin to fail as well. But the acrylic is actually not my most primary concern because, again, you're not going to have a very sudden, violent failure of the acrylic. And because it's clear, it's optically clear, you're going to be able to see that stress cracking happen. So it's relatively easy to inspect. Acrylic, again, is a very understood material. So at least in theory, they would have been able to replace that before it failed. So I don't think that the window was ultimately the failure point either. So one of the things that Stockton Rush flaunted, very, very much, as like, I don't think we need all this stuff, all these oversights and all these, restrictions and stuff. And the reason for it is because he had this, monitoring system. It's called a hull monitoring system that they actually patented. And it basically consists of a number of acoustic sensors and strain sensors laid out over the hull. So here what you can see is there's an acoustic sensor. That's this little gray dot, gray round image. And then there's also the strain sensors, which are these little gold panels. And those are strategically placed around the hull in order to provide two things. So it provides obviously acoustic data. So the idea is that you can hear the hull cracking. So if you're about to have a failure or you're listening for that type of information, you can detect when the carbon fiber has failed or if the carbon fiber has failed. And then there's the strain gauges, and the strain gauges are also giving you data that's basically giving you data about how much the hull deforms. And so the idea being that you can use this data in conjunction with each other to detect potential failures in the hull and be able to either abort the dive, or, subsequently take the hull out of service.
It sounds like a good idea.
It sounds like a good idea, and I actually think that it worked to a certain extent. So if we actually look at the hull, the data for the hull monitoring system, so here's another image. These are those strain gauges right here, and then this is one of those acoustic sensors right here. And here's another image of the layout. There were basically several on the carbon fiber, and then there was also one on the aft titanium ring, but none on the front ring, which I think is concerning. A real-time monitoring is what it was called, real-time monitoring system. Notably, 3 of the 8 acoustic sensors did not appear to be functioning at the time of the implosion, which is concerning as well. Yes, which is not good, which again, to me just speaks to the culture, I don't understand how they were saying, yep, we're ready to dive when half of your system isn't functioning.
It feels like complacency, right? Like we've seen this before in other disasters where, we've gotten away with it before. What's one more dive? What's one more landing? It doesn't matter what the vessel is. The whole point of putting this stuff in here is to have failure points. Like to have, if it's real-time monitoring and you're monitoring 4/7 of it?
Yeah, it doesn't make a lot of sense to me. So what we're looking at now is the amplitude, the acoustic sounds that you're looking at as on dive. So this green line here is depth, and then this purple line here is your acoustic. And so you can see there's a lot of noise. And there's a bunch of noise as you're going into the water, and there's a bunch of noise as you're coming out of the water. But this is kind of what it is supposed to look like. And then, this is the other channel, which was not functioning. And you can see it's just completely flat.
Yeah.
Doing nothing. So, 3 of those sensors were not functioning at the time of the implosion. All the strain sensors were functioning as it would appear. And there are 5 strain gauge. They're called strain gauges, but sensors, same. So there's ultimately 10 strain gauges on the hull in different places. But what I want to talk about is dive 80 A lot of people have talked about dive 80 already, but basically there's this really loud crack that is heard, and it's actually audible to the human ear of people who were working on it at the time. And it's basically, they have this dive, and you can see the timeline here. They're at depth. They're coming back up. They're actually out of the water, or almost out of the water, and there's this big bang that is heard. Apparently, they weren't particularly concerned about it because they didn't do anything.
It was out of the water, Jim. Come on. It's probably just a sea turtle or something.
But you also see this strain gauge response, right? So I thought originally it was like, okay, well, maybe it was like a wave that hit the hull or whatever. But if you look at the strain gauge, so this is what the strain gauge looks like. So on the back half of this is normal. So you have, again, this green line is depicting the depth. So you can see the depth is coming up. You're all the way at depth. You're on the bottom of the ocean. Everything is steady. And then you're coming back up and strain is going back down. This makes sense, right? Like as you're at depth, the hull is compressing. So you're seeing that change, both in the hoop, which is the H, which is the green, the hoop as in like the circumference of the circle. And then the L, the longitudinal stress, which is again, like, linearly along the hull is the change. But then at the very end, again, when you're out of the water, what you see here is, and again, like there's some noise in the sensor reading, but you see this really sharp change.
Yeah.
That happens. And so the United States Coast Guard people end up putting those over top of each other, or excuse me, the NTSB folks put those on top of each other, and you can see that they coincide.
Oh, they happened at the exact same time.
These happen at the exact same time. And to be fair, coincidence is not always causality.
True.
However,
worth looking at.
It's worth looking at. It's for dang sure. And so then what they end up doing is they start looking at the acoustic responses and strain responses of subsequent dives in comparison. So what they actually do is they end up plotting ocean depth to strain output, gauge output, and then you can compare them. And what you end up seeing is that you have a non-linear motion at the beginning of your depth.
So those are supposed to be straight lines.
So the blue lines are what you're supposed to see. And after this incident, you immediately start seeing these non-linear functions, which means that the behavior of the hull has changed following that event.
So the system works. It's actually showing you with data instead of like, a visual.
And then
something's changed. It's interesting that you have multiple dives to compare to. So dive 80 and 81 isn't where it failed.
Correct. So dive 88 is the dive that imploded. You can see here they've laid out 5 different dives, and you can see like the trend should be like linear. So dive 75 and dive 80 are both pretty much linear. That's good. Or at least that's what you would normally see from all the other dives. And then dives 81, 82, 83, they're all kind of following this curve trajectory.
It yields up to it. That's so cool.
And then you can see the same thing happening in the longitudinal strain, but it's kind of happening in the other direction. But that's kind of deceiving because the way that strain gauges work is they measure the voltage drop across the conductor as it changes length, basically. Yeah. And so the millivolts really, it's not telling you it doesn't tell you how much it moves. It only tells you
that it moved.
You have to calibrate it. So we don't have that calibration data to compare to. So we can't say, it moved 0.001 inches or millimeters or whatever.
Right.
But you can see that it does move. We just don't really have a scale for how much it's moving because we don't have that calibration data. This should have been a huge red flag. Something had changed in the hull. Dive 83 is the end of the season, right? So basically, this was in 2022, last dive of 2022, dive 83. And again, you can see those.
Like a non-linear path to start.
That non-linear path stopped. Yeah, exactly.
As you start diving.
So I think that's a huge red flag. And there's been some discussion about like what happened to cause that. And one of the things that we see in the wreckage, so there's actually rubbing damage between, again, we talked about these co-bonded layers. There's damage between those co-bonded layers, which means that those were fundamentally moving across each other, right? As the hull went down and compressed, there was actually slipping that was occurring between those layers. which ultimately is further damaging the layers, and compromising the structure. Ultimately, what I think happened is that as you compress the hull, at a certain point, those get bound up together. There's enough friction there that they're going to be reluctant to kind of release themselves, if you want to think about it that way. And so, what I think happened on dive 80 is basically as they went down, those fibers compressed, the hull compressed, and then kind of got stuck. And then once it's up out of the water, it's no longer under pressure. So now that the material wants to return to its original formation, and so it does so suddenly and violently.
And that's what the sound was.
And I think that's what the sound was, is basically those, again, maybe it was, the hull got set down on the docking platform, and that was the impetus that kind of shocked the layers to release and then, very suddenly spring back into place. But I do think that's where it ultimately what kind of happened. And that shock of that immediate spring back, I think ultimately caused the delaminations that led to the failure. So the carbon fiber is sort of to blame, but I don't believe the carbon fiber ruptured itself. So let's now...
To all of us non-engineers, at least I thought this was like the vessel worked, it was in good shape, and then all of this happened over one dive. You're showing me data that proves something happened 8 dives before, more, and we saw the same data over and over. Where they just ignored it?
I think they either ignored that data or they didn't look at it.
I don't know what's worse.
There was, I remember from the testimony that somebody basically said it was just or dismissal, because I believe that they chalked it up to the structure outside of basically the frame shifting under loading conditions, right? But I really think that you have to look at the additional data afterwards and really question the validity of that assumption. And they had like a whole year to do it. I mean, it's not like they were immediately. It's not like this data. Dive 83 was the last dive of 2022. The implosion happened in 2023. So it's like they had time to look at this, and they did not. So I really think it's an instance that they did not do their due diligence.
I would have thought like at the end of the season, you're taking the damn thing apart and putting it back together after testing each piece again.
And again, like that's part of the problem with the carbon fiber hull is it's actually very difficult to inspect the hull because the glue joint is completely inaccessible.
That's true. You have to replace it every time.
And the carbon fiber, you can't even take it apart without destroying it. There's actually, so one of the cool things about OceanGate is that they actually took videos of all the stuff that they did. Like Stockton Rush took a lot of video of all the assembly processes and building the hull and all this. But yeah, so like you have this big giant titanium ring, and then the glue layup. They're cleaning everything with acetone before they, or something together, put it together. But basically, why is the video quality such crap? Okay. Oh, it's because it's not good video quality. But yeah, so basically they're like spreading the epoxy. It's just glued on basically. And they're applying glue to both sides, which is good. It's what you want to see. But it's just in an open environment. Nobody's really wearing any sort of like hairnets or anything.
Not a good ventilation system in that big of a space, surely.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know, right? Like, but I'm not a carbon fiber expert.
Well, I'm just thinking about how they build airplanes. Like, foreign object debris has to relate to sub-assembly too.
Yes, I would imagine so. And like, that's one of the criticisms. But so here you can see like, and that's it, right? Like once that goes together, ne'er the two shall be unjoined.
And you're never going to inspect it again.
And you literally can't inspect it. So you could have flaws from the beginning and you would never be able to know.
Interesting.
So when you put a vessel under pressure, everything flexes. The thing though is that titanium and carbon fiber flex at very different rates, right? So they have very different material properties. And the cross-sectional areas of these pieces, it's very complicated assembly. So everything is flexing at different rates. And the problem with that, Derek, is that while the glue joint might be able to hold the stress of of the pressure normally, right? Like nominally, if you end up having the material that it's bonded to shifting as well, you're actually asking the epoxy to basically mediate the difference of strain and the difference of deformation between the carbon fiber and the titanium. Does that make sense?
Do you like have a gap?
Sort of. So, for example, if you had no glue joint at the, let's just say that you were to bend both of those things under that pressure without that glue joint, right? Ultimately, what you'd end up having is that carbon fiber would bend because it's also long. It's a cylindrical object. It's going to compress more in the center than it is at the ends, just because of the way that the loading happens. And so what that's going to do is it's going to cause the top section of that carbon fiber to actually pull away from the titanium, because it's going to become sucked in a little bit, right? Does that make sense?
Sounds like if I were to bend a tube and put another tube within it.
Yes. And you can actually simplify it even further, right? So you can think of it as, if you just think of one side of the tube at a time, you can simplify it to thinking about it just like a beam, right? So like a piece of wood, right? And so what you can do is you can say, okay, well, you're putting force down on the center, so it's the ends of it are going to come up. The ends are going to lift, basically, right? And so the problem with that is you're asking the glue not only to support the shear strength or the shear loading from the carbon fiber to the titanium, you're also asking that epoxy to support the tensile loading between the titanium and the carbon fiber as the carbon fiber deforms more than the titanium does.
Because of the rates. It's for all intents and purposes bending slower or faster than the other material.
Correct. So the joint was not designed such that it would compress at the same rate and at the same direction as the carbon fiber.
What does that do?
Ultimately, I think that it ripped apart the glue. It basically caused the glue to separate from the titanium. So if you look at the joint design, you end up basically having this very large flat section. That's the glue surface, right? Oh, there's actually some really good pictures of the glue surface. This is the forward ring, and we're looking at the top surface here is the surface that was bonded to the carbon fiber. You notice a distinct lack. There's a little bit of green over here, but there's no glue left on the surface. That's really important to note. And what that tells me is that ultimately the glue fell away from the titanium. So the glue joint between the titanium and the carbon fiber, as we talked about a little bit earlier, is kind of this, C-channel effect where you have, like, if you take your hand and make a big C out of it, and then take your other hand and make a fist and put those together like a socket. That's the joint between the carbon fiber and the titanium. And that was a glued joint. And in this image from the NTSB report, you can see, and this is coming out, I don't know which document this is coming from. My apologies. But this is coming from a video by Scott Manley on the subject. You can see the 5-inch section of the carbon fiber, and then these little end bits, which were the titanium that came over the top of the carbon fiber. And this is the aft section that we're looking at right now. And you can see the layer lines are actually visible in the adhesive. And you can see that there's a wrinkle in there.
Oh, so that's just an impression of where the carbon fiber used to be.
That's correct. That's an impression of where the carbon fiber used to be. And the forward port was originally much the same. And you can see that there is not much epoxy left on this at all. What that tells me is that this surface was not adequately prepared to take the epoxy. In other words, there wasn't enough roughening or whatever to make it really stick.
Yes, you usually like sand the surface before you add epoxy.
Yeah, very heavily. And I've heard some stuff about this potentially being reused from the version 1 Submersible, but I'm not sure about that. So I can't.
Big old speculation on that one.
Big old speculation, but that's what I've heard. But ultimately what this indicates to me is a glue failure happened. And I think what happened is basically as the, and we're going to talk about this one now, as the carbon fiber flexed away from the titanium over time, what that actually caused is because that glue is really what's transferring the load from the, and this is, I think, one of the things that people don't really understand about this right now is like, that glue joint is structural, right? Like what you're doing is you're taking the load from that carbon fiber and you're transmitting that into the titanium end cap with a shear load from that from that glue joint. That epoxy is transferring that stress from the carbon fiber to the titanium, and that's acting in shear. So there's a tremendous amount of force trying to basically force those two surfaces apart from each other. And ultimately what happens, I believe, is that the flexing basically of the carbon fiber away from the titanium ultimately pulls that joint loose, that glue loose, and all of that force is then supported only by the internal you can see it, this very small flange that they have in this image, inner flange structure. All of that pressure, all of that force is only being supported by that inner flange, and that titanium is just there's not enough cross section there to support that weight, and it just shears. I think that is ultimately what failed in the Titan submersible and caused that very sudden implosion, because basically what you're going to have is there's going to be one section. It doesn't take anything but a tiny, tiny little section of that glue to pull away, allow high pressure water into that joint. And then basically that entire glue surface is going to immediately fail. And then the flange is going to have to take the entire load of the ocean at, I think it's like 400 atmospheres of pressure.
Sheesh.
And then that little tiny titanium ring is just not going to be able to hold it. It's going to immediately shear in one spot, and then that is going to have like a rippling effect. And we're talking about tens of thousands of a second. Everything's going to go, and then just boom, and that's where you have that implosion.
So for our so atmospheres is a measure of pressure. I think a lot of us in America use PSI, but it's pretty much the average atmospheric pressure you experience on the surface, right? So that means 400 times atmospheric pressure in milliseconds. One thing about this story, Jim, about why the Titan failed and how the biology side is super easy on how they died instantly and blended. Yes. Like you just became human soup.
And so like oh my gosh. And like the pictures of the actual Titan on the floor, I mean, it's right here. Like they're all in the back of that, underneath all of that carbon fiber that's just been rammed into the back of that. That's where they are. Like they're all just shoved into the back of the aft hemisphere, along with all the other stuff that was in the sub, and a lot of the hull actually got jammed into there as well.
Gee, I'll overlay on the YouTube there's like an animation of what that may have looked like. You really don't get an idea of the scaling in time. For reference, the time it takes for light to reach your eyes, for you to see something, and the time it takes for the neuron pathways to tell your brain, hey, something happened. They didn't even recognize that they died. It was so fast.
Yeah.
You wouldn't even have had time to perceive it without like a slow motion camera. So I guess the one benefit is they did not suffer, the souls that were lost. It was as instantaneous as we can get. Like you would, like, it's not like knowing an aircraft, the aircraft goes pop. The sound wouldn't even have made it to your ears before you're dead. So it's something to think about.
You wouldn't have been able to process it, even if
like by the time a problem is found, you were missed seconds ago.
Yeah. So, I mean, like that is some small mercy.
Yeah, at least it was quick.
Because there was this idea originally that, okay, well, maybe they were stuck somewhere either on the surface or on the ocean floor with limited oxygen.
That's what the media was running. Like the Coast Guard was looking for the vessel. They thought, okay, there was countdown timers. It was kind of cruel. There was countdown timers on the news. Like this is how much oxygen we estimate they would have. But in hindsight, we know it was instant. Like, it did not, I mean, and it's sad. The Navy knew this. Like the Navy has some sonar technology that is not something you tell the public about. So, military and government knew the truth. They just couldn't tell, or they didn't want to tell, because that would tell them, our enemies, about our capabilities.
I think there's more to it than that. I think there is some of that, but I think also like in search and rescue, right? And until you know for sure that there is no rescue, it is a recovery, you treat it as if there's a
That's
rescue.
fair. Like if you're looking for a body, as a lifeguard, you treat it as you have to let that timer go out.
That's right. And so I think that was the right thing to do, is to, I think the media went the wrong way with it. But from the search and rescue standpoint, the correct thing to do is to treat it as a rescue until you know it's.
But they had strong evidence to see that they just had to confirm it. They probably had a good hypothesis and some data to support it early. It's interesting to look at because when we think about, like, for example, I'm going to pull back a little bit of history. You ever heard of the Kursk disaster?
It sounds familiar, but
it was a Russian submarine, huge, right? And there was this event that caused it to, have some failures. And the bad part about the Kursk disaster, without going into the details, is that many of the crew survived for a while, to the point where they're popping oxygen packs. Like, it was a very traumatic ordeal, to the point where one of those sailors on board was able to write out their last words over the last few hours. I feel like this is a way better way to go, because, like you said, it's mercy. The sea does not care about you. And, when you're at a depth like that, water coming up to you, that is a terrifying way to die. This, at least it was like, you didn't even detect there was a problem before it happened. So I guess there is some, at least they didn't suffer at the end of the day. Yeah. It should have never happened, but at least they didn't suffer.
Yeah. And again, like, I think we've gone way off we're running super long today, but, a lot of it will get cut down, but I think the sad part about it is that there were a lot of points at which this could have been caught.
Yeah. It is preventable. You had 3 different variants. You're telling me you used parts from like the second variant. And all of these SMEs, subject matter experts that work with submarines, are telling you, hey, we don't think the carbon fiber is a good idea. You have the engineering companies saying, hey, your window idea is a cool idea, but we wouldn't suggest running with it just yet. It needs more research. And then you mean to tell me there's actual emails over the course of this event where all of these checks and balances you put in the system, you're ignoring that sensors have failed. It's all preventable.
I think that's the cruelest tragedy of it all, right? Is that this acoustic monitoring system, this real-time monitoring system, actually worked, and that was like the whole thing that gave them the confidence to go ahead with their new experimental design. And this actually could have been a huge triumph for OceanGate, right? This could have been like a huge thing of like, obviously not the implosion, but in terms of like looking at dive number 80 and saying, hey, this is where it failed. We're going to destructively test this hull. We're going to figure out what's going on.
Then you make your V3.
And you make V3, right? And like that could have been like a huge win in terms of like proving everybody wrong.
Because I have to look at it from both sides, right? This is a very expensive venture. They get their R&D money from bringing people down. I think it's grossly irresponsible because like it's not like these are folks that worked for OceanGate. It's one pilot and then a few people who are just, some of them are researchers, there was one guy's kid on board, and it's increasingly sad because they're fully innocent. You're going in with a trust that the company's done their due diligence. And this is an example of complacency. You get 80 plus dives, and you start, getting a little laxer with the rules. All of a sudden, we know we can't, where you would do a complete rebuild or, like you said, a destructive, analysis so that you can build the next version. I'm looking at it from the CEO's perspective. He's like, that's money we're not making. So he's pushing the envelope. This could have been solved by being remote vehicle.
Yeah, I think, but that doesn't get people down.
Exactly. But like while you're testing it, like you can have a remote vehicle go down, and maybe there's lessons for, I guess there's no lessons learned from the SMEs because they do their due diligence, right?
I think there actually are a lot of lessons that can be taken from the Titan disaster. I think from an engineering perspective, we've learned a lot about how carbon fiber behaves under pressure and what you may or may not be able to do in order to mitigate some of those problems. I think we've learned a lot about how that glue joint needs to be constructed. And I think ultimately, maybe shouldn't be constructed, which is, again, is part of it. And I think honestly, like what this is going to do is because carbon fiber does have some really interesting potential. Again, because of the weight savings, because of the buoyancy of it, the material. It's a fantastic material when used correctly. But I think this is really going to put a huge stop to using carbon fiber underwater for a long time.
Even if it is a good idea with the right research. There's some parallels to that in biology too. You remember CRISPR-Cas? There was a gene editing process that was made, and everyone was super excited about it. This is going to be the future. They thought this is how we're going to make new vaccines and all these other huge jumps in research. One idiot in China decided to avoid regulation, and the long and short of the story is he ended up causing a pregnant mother to get a sexually transmitted disease, and the children did too. Just doing unsanctioned, unregulated experiments. And to my knowledge, to this day, there hasn't been as much buy-in to CRISPR-Cas9 research. Fun fact about CRISPR-Cas9, guess where they found it? A deep sea ocean vent. So ocean exploration, in my opinion, is directly important to our climate change crisis, how we make new medicines. It's more important than space at the moment. Like space is going to help humanity 300, 400 years out. But this stuff exists on below our planet's surface today. And tragedies like this, it just pushes back scientific process for no good reason. And human lives. It's just, like you said, regulations are written in blood.
And there are going to be regulations that come out of this. And that's part of the Coast Guard hearing was part of that discussion was surrounding potential regulation, or calls for regulation, from some of the different, witnesses. But yeah, I mean, I think there's lessons to be taken about the construction. We've learned a lot about how carbon fiber and titanium, holds up or doesn't hold up under immense pressure. I think the acoustic monitoring system. We saw
that's a great idea,
right? It's a great idea. It's worked,
kind of an elegant design too. You're just using specialized microphones, and I don't know. I'm not the electronic engineer, but long and short of it, a capacitor on a adhesive, I assume. When the wires bend or stretch, it gives you a millivoltage that you can detect, and over time, you can track that to events. It's a really good idea. It's used it's used in regular shipping processes for hull strain. I know it's been used in old aircraft design back in the Cold War, when you're trying to go supersonic for the first time. Where's your ship bending? It's better to find out while it's happening than after your pilot gets killed.
Yes. So, I think there's some really, this is part of the tragedy of it. There's some really interesting engineering concepts, that worked really well, in the Titan submersible. But again, it was just the execution wasn't there and the foresight to safety wasn't there. And there was just this attitude of dismissal to these really, potentially serious problems. And ultimately it caught up with them. And I think it really speaks to, the danger of cost cutting measures and the danger of this reckless behavior, fail fast, fail hard, fail quick mentality. That's kind of this Silicon Valley idea that's been coming to engineering. Well, it's not only that you have to be first, but so it's in Silicon Valley, it's fail fast, fail often.
Well, when it's software, that's fine. That's not life supporting. Sure.
That's exactly. But when it comes to when it comes to going to 6,000 PSI, it's kind of a different story. Yeah, different story. So, I think the big red flags for me is lack of testing, lack of destructive testing of scale models, lack of, frankly, oversight still. It's just you should have a third party come in and check your math. you know.
And these things
You
should have
a
an
third party
expiration
come
date.
in and check your designs.
I think these things should have an expiration date. Even if you think it works, it should have so many cycles before you retire it, just as a part of your standard procedure.
Right. But part of the problem is that they didn't do enough research to find
It's
that.
a bad decade for submarines, Jim. We're recording this at the beginning of October 2024, and there are reports coming out from our Navy, the U.S. Navy, that a Chinese vessel, one of the newest nuclear-powered submarines in existence at this point, sunk in port. And of course, it's China, so we're probably never going to know why. But it's just been a bad decade for submersibles.
No, yeah. But, you know, it's just what it is. It's unfortunate. But, like, and this is one of the things, right? Because, like, one of the things that Stockton Rush said is, like, you know, there's always a risk for progress. And, like, I understand that, and I, to a certain extent, agree with it. But the big flaw that I have with Stockton Rush's argument is that these people, the passengers of the submarine, and they called them like, oh, they're mission specialists.
They're just tourists.
They're passengers. They're just basically people. They don't have a fundamental understanding of the physics of the sub. They just don't have that experience. They don't have that expertise.
Mission specialist. That is jarring.
They did.
Deceptive.
They did.
Every time I go on an aircraft,
it is legitimate.
I'm a co-pilot, bro.
They're passenger. Like, you can call a rose a flower, or you can call a rose a duck. It's not a duck. It's a rose. You know, they're passengers.
Mission specialist. And NASA would be appalled.
Yeah.
So, like, that's just, it's gross because it shows a fundamental, like, this isn't my problem. And you're trying to blame the passengers because of your failure. I mean, it's just.
Well, what they're trying to do is absolve themselves of responsibility. Like OceanGate, Stockton Rush, ultimately were trying to absolve themselves of responsibility for the failure of the Titan.
I honestly wish Stockton Rush wasn't on this so that he could be tried for his crimes. And like, at least have some level of justice for the families, but it's like he got the quick way out too.
Yeah.
In his head, he died a year ago. Well, I guess he didn't know he died, but, you know, he thinks he's the top of the world.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, I think there is both a mercy and a cruel irony to the situation that really kind of makes me think about.
Is not life
existentially
but a cruel irony, Jim? Are we not just writing a joke where we're the punchline?
Well, on that note, that's been our episode of Everything's a Spring. Everybody, I hope you've enjoyed. If you followed us to the end, make sure that you shake off your existential dread by consuming a wonderful beverage out of our sponsor for today's video, the Whiskey Grail. A charred white oak drinking vessel made to mimic a bourbon barrel. It's like drinking straight out of the cask. You can find us online at www.whiskeygrail.com. Derek, do you have anything
for our
to plug?
partners at YouTube? Not an actual sponsor. He owns the company. We're not getting paid. Don't monetize us. Boom, baby.
Oh, that's facts. That's facts.
And also to the NTSB
But anyway,
and all other federal agencies, we are not professionals. This is not intended to be an official report, but thank you for the research. We're definitely going to use it.
Yeah, I think one of the excellent things about the Coast Guard hearing really is that everything got laid out on the table. And I think if you guys have interest, our listeners, if you have interest in kind of looking into this further for yourself, there's a huge amount of documentation that's available to you. It's on the United States Coast Guard's website.
It'll link in the description.
Link in description. There you go. But uscg.mil basically is going to get you there. And you can get footage and you can review footage of the ROVs as they discover the wreckage of the Titan. You can see them pulling stuff up off the ocean floor. You can look at the images of the various different hulls, cross sections that were made, the porosity studies on the carbon fiber, the glue delamination, all of that stuff goes into huge detail. I mean, they spent 2 weeks on this hearing. So, I mean, there's a lot of footage, really some incredible testimonies, into the failure and what led to this failure. And really the biggest takeaway for me is like, just be very careful about that company culture, because company culture, ultimately what you're doing is you're making the system that will create the outcomes. And if you create a system where safety is secondary, and this dismissal of data is commonplace, you're going to end up with a tragedy like this. I mean, that system generates the outcomes.
Yeah, man, it's sad because like in capitalism, it's so easy to blame a company because a company can't go to jail. A company can't be tried for anything but money. On that note, let's bounce.
Let's bounce, Derek.